Just waiting for everyone else to join so that everyone can start. Slowly joining. Welcome, everyone. I see it's still filling up, and I'm waiting so that everyone can, so that we can start. Right, it's 10. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue that we organized jointly with ECFR, so the European Council on Foreign Relations, called European Cohesion Through the Pandemic, the State of Play 1 year into COVID-19. I'm Sophie Pornschlegel. I'm a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center and the project leader for Connecting Europe, which is organizing this event today. And I'm delighted to moderate this round, which will take 1 hour. Quickly on Connecting Europe, what is this? It's a project between the European Policy Center and Stiftung Mercator, and the idea is to connect civil society organizations across Europe with EU decision makers. So the idea is to transnationalize the EU policy debates. And that's exactly what we're doing today. ECFR is part of that network, and we're delighted to have organized this event with them today to present the results of the Cohesion Monitor. That is a data set that looks at cohesion within the EU. And just to mention that the European Cohesion Monitor is also funded by Stiftung Mercator. So quickly on the broad context of this event, it's been almost a year since the pandemic started. There have been several steps taken by the EU to respond to the crisis. We all know it's a crisis with different facets. So it's a health crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, and even some have said a political crisis or democratic crisis. But we will focus mostly on what do we understand by cohesion today and look at the divides that existed before the crisis and where we stand now. We know that the crisis is different from others. It's symmetric, but it has asymmetric differences. So the consequences are different depending on the EU member states, also depending on the healthcare systems, the welfare systems, and the state of the economy in the different member states. So we all know that in December, Next Generation EU has been decided with the German Council presidency, and we have the chance today to also discuss the view on the Portuguese Council presidency that has the difficult task of implementing that huge recovery program. Also, as we're speaking to a Brussels audience, I just wanted to make sure that this event was speaking about a broad sense of cohesion. So we're not only speaking about EU cohesion and structural funds, but really cohesion in its broadest sense that also includes the sense of unity, solidarity between member states and between the populations in the EU. So much about the content. I just wanted to also say that there's a small change in the program. Unfortunately, the State Secretary for European Affairs, Mrs. Zacharias, could not join us today, but we're delighted to welcome Ambassador Vinhas, who is Director General for European Affairs at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Portugal and coordinates the Council Presidency for Portugal. So it's great to have you here, Mr. Vinhas. And I will go on to present our other speakers here today. First, we have Jana Puglierin, who is head of the Berlin office of ECFR and senior fellow, as well as Rafael, who coordinates the Cohesion Monitor. And they will present for about 10 minutes the different divides that they saw from this Cohesion Monitor. And we will then comment on them, starting with Ambassador Vinhas, who will present the priorities of the Portuguese Council presidency, then going on to Mathieu Lefèvre, who is CEO and co-founder of More in Common, an organization that is represented in, correct me if I'm wrong, the US, UK, France, and Germany, and also did a lot of surveys on, I would say, the more individual side, so looking at populations and their sense of cohesion, whether you can see polarizations within the societies. So you'll comment on that perspective. And last but not least, we've got our own Janis Emmanouilidis, who is Director of Studies at the European Policy Center, and will comment on the polycrisis and the broader EU context in which we find ourselves in this COVID-19 crisis. So I think I talked enough, so I will give the floor to Jana to present the results of the ECFR Cohesion Monitor.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Rafael and I are actually delighted that we can present our findings, and we thank you very much for your interest in them. I ask Rafael in a moment to share his screen so you will see some slides, because I think that makes it easier to understand basically what we are presenting. So Rafael, could you please start sharing? What we present today is based on the so-called EU Cohesion Monitor that we at ECFR have started to develop in 2016 and that we now are happy to present as its fourth edition. And we launched this in December 2020. So maybe a brief word about the EU Cohesion Monitor, because this is the data set our findings are based on. And I'm grateful that Sophie already mentioned that cohesion, as we understand it, is not the usual kind of Brussels definition of it, but we understand cohesion as the glue that holds the EU together. We think that cohesion is actually shaped by a variety of factors that make Europeans more willing to cooperate with one another. And the factors that we look at include the connection between societies and economies, people-to-people contacts across borders, as well as people's attitudes and expectations. So what we actually have developed is a data set based on publicly available data. We look at 42 different factors drawn from such sources as the Eurobarometer and Eurostat. And this fourth edition we are particularly proud of, because now the Cohesion Monitor has become an interactive data tool that you actually can navigate on your own and can look at online. You can find it on our website, www.ecfr.eu, and just look for the Cohesion Monitor. So we have broken the concept of European cohesion down in two building blocks, basically. We call them individual cohesion and structural cohesion. Individual cohesion is about EU citizens' experiences, expectations, beliefs, levels of well-being, and voting patterns. So in a nutshell, we could say that with individual cohesion, we try to measure the degree to which individuals in member states are prepared to stick together as part of the EU. And the other building block is structural cohesion, where we basically look at member states' economic and political ties. So in a nutshell, structural cohesion measures the degree to which countries work as an integrated part of the EU. I think that's enough of a general introduction. And now to our concrete findings. So when we were analyzing the data of the fourth edition of the monitor, we wanted to look at how the COVID pandemic affects or might affect European cohesion in the future. And so we started tracking those factors in 2007 and have data available until 2019. And so we started actually on very good terms with some very optimistic and findings and very good news for the EU, because contrary to all the doom and gloom headlines of recent years, where the EU basically was collapsing on a daily basis, European cohesion kind of measured through the 42 factors was very strong in the period that our monitor covered. So despite a lot of economic distress, the rise of populist parties, and also that sense of stagnation in the EU integration process, cohesion actually became stronger and stronger. And member states between each other, but also societies remained strongly interconnected. And we were very happy about this finding and about our data, because this tends to be forgotten how kind of closely interconnected the Europeans are and how dense this network actually is. So looking at trends, we found that in 2019, European cohesion, both individual cohesion and structural cohesion, reached its highest level since 2007. But while this is very positive news, the foundations for what we have identified as the triple challenge to European cohesion due to the pandemic were in place long before the COVID-19 crisis struck. We have identified basically three regional challenges, and I can give you only a very brief overview. If you want to learn more, we've written a fabulous policy brief about it, packed with data, much more data than we can show you now. But let me start first with the Southern challenge. Looking at individual and structural cohesion, we found that there is a special challenge for the South, pre-existing before the crisis. So countries like Spain, Greece, and Italy, but also Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia have been definitely so far among the worst affected by pandemic in economic terms. But they also have really deep pre-existing economic vulnerabilities. So they are particularly at risk of stagnation, rising unemployment, and kind of further diverging from wealthier member states. And you can see, we just picked one example from our data set. We have one factor that consists of several indicators where we look at economic resilience. And so the grayish line is basically the EU average when it comes to economic resilience, the EU 27 average. And maybe, Rafael, you can use your mouse to point to the lines, because then you see the pink line for Italy, the orange line for Spain, and at the very bottom, you see the Greek development, basically. And so we have a timeline starting from 2007 up to 2019, and you see basically while, there was already kind of some weaknesses when we started to track in 2007. The situation got worse throughout the Eurozone crisis, but still in 2019, when the pandemic has hit us, there was a kind of weak economic resilience in some of the member states. So giving these pre-existing economic vulnerabilities, and given the fact that this crisis has hit the South stronger, we worry that this leads to growing frustration among the populations in the South and more skepticism about the European project. This is the Southern challenge, and we have more data on trust in the EU and all this. This is just giving you basically a glimpse. Then we have the Northern challenge, where actually we were very struck to find that Europeans' expectations around the economic prospect for their household, their country, and the EU were lowest in wealthy countries of the North, such as the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and Finland. So the Dutch and the Germans had a very pessimistic assessment of their household's financial situation, as well of that of their country and the EU. Austrians had disturbingly low expectations about the prospects of life overall improving, and Finns had little hope for the economic prospect of their country and the EU. So here you see the factor indication. And again, I mean, while the Swedes are doing quite well, although the line is declining, if you look at 2019, you see that the Netherlands and Austria, but also other countries I mentioned, have basically less positive expectations or about their livelihood and economic fortunes. And we fear that those northern countries basically could get increasingly frustrated with the European Union, because there are also other indicators in individual cohesion, and that they might lose patience with the less affluent member states, and that they have increasing problems to understand the perspectives of the southern countries that have suffered from the economic crisis. So we fear that Northerners could grow more detached from the European project because COVID actually has an additional huge impact on people's feelings about the future, which have been very negative in the North overall when it comes to the individual countries, but also the EU. And lastly, we have identified a Central and Eastern European challenge. And this is particularly Interesting, we look at a factor that's called experiencing Europe, and within the factor we look at indicators like how many foreigners live in Central and Eastern Europe from other EU member states, how many contacts are there, how many cross-border contacts, but basically how much do people living in Central and Eastern Europe interact with other Europeans. And we found out that these contacts have been less than in the average of the EU already previously to the crisis. So Central and Eastern Europe were kind of mingling less with other Europeans and had less personal experiences of what it means to be a European, of traveling, of meeting other Europeans. And while the countries in Central and Eastern Europe were strongly integrated in terms of structural cohesion, in individual cohesion, there are shortcomings, and the citizens basically lacked a sense of connection to Europe. We think that the crisis has weakened not only national economies, but democracy, human rights, rule of law within certain member states, particularly in the regions, and we in Central and Eastern Europe, and we fear that kind of there are several factors that could lead to a growing detachment of this region, and also a growing frustration of the countries in the north with the region. Yeah, and maybe that's enough food for thought. We have, of course, as a good think tank, also some recommendations, but maybe we leave them for later, and I'm looking forward to your comments and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana, for this short but very efficient presentation. Two things I forgot to mention before, and I'm sorry about that. I guess I forgot the housekeeping because we're so used to Zoom events all the time. But of course, you're welcome to ask your questions. So you can either post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and then we will unmute you and you can present yourself and ask your question later on, because there is time for a Q&A session. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this event. We want it to be interactive and to interact with the audience. And the second thing I forgot to mention as well, I'm sorry about that, is that this is a recorded session and it will be available later on. So in case you have to drop out because of another event, you can still watch it until the end. So much about the housekeeping, and I'm sorry I had to put that in now. But to go back to the topic of European cohesion, we will start with the comments now, and I will give the floor to Ambassador Vinhas to give us the perspective from the Portuguese Council presidency, knowing that we're in the implementation phase of the recovery plan. So it would be interesting to know what kind of priorities you see. We know that social policies were also an important priority within your program. So if you could maybe comment on what Jana just said and add onto it.
Well, thank you. Good morning to you all. Thank you again to the EPC and the Ecfr for having me. I think I'm the only Thai around. I mean, it's a problem with diplomats, but anyway, I'll try my best. Well, maybe three initial remarks on this. First, to thank you, Jana, for the presentation. Very useful to feed our reflection. But maybe three comments. The first is about the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic will impact in Europe, and will provoke some transformation. I mean, historically, it has always been like that. I mean, great crises, being pandemics, wars, or economic crises, have an impact. It's too soon to know how far that impact will go. First, because we're still in the pandemic. We are actually in the peak of a third wave. And second, we don't know yet, is still too soon to know how much it will impact, how big the economic and social crisis will be. I mean, so we still in a phases that we are managing the health front as a priority, so it's a bit soon to know how deep the crisis in economic and social dimensions will be. what we do know is two things. First, that we, for the first time in history, we have dealt with a pandemic like this from an entirely humanistic perspective. The first priority was to protect human life and human health. And if we look back to the history, it was not like that. Never. So this is a very big step forward in the civilizational terms, but of course it has a cost in terms of economic and social cost. That's for sure. The second remark is that is about the EU response. I mean, there's that joke that when facing a crisis, the EU is always the first moment is chaos, then long process of discussions, and finally we reach a consensus around a suboptimal solution. Well, this time, at least on the financial response, financial and economical response, I think we had a very good response. I mean, not suboptimal, but I would say a very good one. I mean, we have been able to have a robust, ambitious, innovative response. I mean, we should not be afraid of words, but the size, the very interesting mix between loans and grants, and even this is a sort of a first step towards issuing a common debt. And if we count also with the governance mechanisms of this financial package, we are on a sort of a threshold of a common budgetary policy. I mean, so this was really very different from the euro crisis in 2000, from 2010 to 14. The reaction was swift, robust, and that's very, very important. That was very important, and that also showed some cohesion, which is the topic of this webinar. So it showed a cohesion and resolve. Of course, the time is of the essence. I mean, now, because we know that we have to go through different phases to have the money or this financial package running in our economies. And we are very much overwhelmed by else language, and so if I can use a metaphor, the economies of the member states are basically in an induced coma, and the ventilators in this case are the national budgets. And this, of course, it's difficult to manage as time goes by, and it's difficult to manage particularly in countries that have external debt, an higher external debt. So time is of the essence. We have now to go through the ratification of the decision of own resources, and then to the approval of the national recovery and reform plans. And I mean, the most optimistic scenarios that we have as presidency we might have some the first tranches of the funds by June. That's the most optimistic. But if we have any delay in one of these stages that I mentioned, we will have to postpone it to December or even to September, and that can have a very negative impact. The third remark, and I don't want to talk too much in this, is about our presidency. Of course, that we align the presidency with the current situation. We align the priorities of the president with the current situation, and so our first and top priority is, of course, the health response to the pandemic. Not everything is a responsibility of the presidency, but of course we are supporting the Commission in its procurement efforts, and we are working very much in a very close coordination and a very intense coordination, a daily basis coordination between member states and the different filières of the European Union. So from the working groups to the European Council, we have been dealing with this very intensely since the beginning of January. So so that's the overarching priority. If we don't succeed in the vaccination strategy, it's difficult to succeed in the other priorities. The second priority, I already mentioned it, it's the economic response to the crisis. And so we are pushing and investing politically, my government, the Prime Minister, in work the funds with his colleagues in order to speed up the process of internal ratification by the 26 parliaments of the member states. We have tried to lead by the example. We were the third ones to ratify in Portugal, so that phase is already passed in what concerns to Portugal, and we also are pushing to have the national plans to reform and resilience approved as soon as possible. So this is clearly in parallel with the health. It's the two main priorities. This is obvious. If we don't succeed on these two ones, the rest will be then. I mean, I don't have time to go through. Of course, that economic recovery will have to be anchored very much in the digital and in the climate agendas. Transitions, and then, as you mentioned, the social response. I mean, we have thought about giving great priority to the social response, to the social pillar or the social dimension, and the enhancing of the social model of Europe, because we thought that we needed more social dimension in Europe, always knowing and quite aware that this is a national competence and not a EU common policy. We are aware of that, but we need more social dimension to mitigate and to the impacts of the twin transitions, the digital and that will have huge impacts in our societies, in our economies, in the labor market. So it's that was our idea still in the late 2019. But then with the pandemic, it even makes more sense. I mean, we have to, and all our governments are working very much in the social dimension with the measures and the legislation on a national basis to mitigate the impact of the social impact of the crisis. So the social will be a very important issue in our presidency. The highlight will be a summit summit in Oporto in May. We hope that if COVID allows, it will be a physical meeting, and it will have two moments. The first one with the main stakeholders, like the summit in Gothenburg 3 years ago, and then a summit of the EU leaders on the second moment. So, and we hope that can have an important political message enhancing the social pillar of the European Union. Finally, in very, very quick terms, I mean, the external dimension, I mean, the EU, although reinforcing its strategic autonomy, because there's lessons to learn also about the pandemic, and we need to strengthen our strategic autonomy, but a strategic autonomy that is open to the world. So we have here some basic priorities. Of course, the US, it's a unique opportunity to reset and to re-engage. We all share that view, but also we have to look into Africa. We have to look into the Southern Partnership with our southern partners in the Mediterranean. We have to move ahead with our trade agenda, which is probably the most powerful tool of the European Union in terms of external agenda. We have pending some important trade agreements with Latin America that we would like very much to go ahead. And so in a nutshell, I can then develop some more elements, but this is in a nutshell how in these three my initial comments, and from the presidency perspective, how do we see that we should tackle the crisis and avoid in the future any lack of cohesion in our EU project. Thank you very much, Sophie, and I think it's enough for now.
Thank you for this overview, Ambassador Vinhas. And I think it's very important that you mentioned the humanistic aspect of the crisis, and that's a perfect transition to Mathieu Lefèvre, who is the CEO and co-founder of More in Common, whereas the EU often looks at interstate solidarity and cohesion and maybe a little less citizens. I think this crisis clearly has shown that maybe something shifted. Looking at Mathieu Lefèvre, I think it would be great to hear more about the study you published, which is also based on a survey looking at polarization and cohesion within societies. So I think you looked at several EU member states plus the US, and it would be great to hear, especially on that aspect of cohesion, what you found out. And if you have any recommendations to the EU, please also go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and also I learned a lot from the presentation, but also from reading the report. I agree very much with the frame around cohesion, and particularly with the emphasis on individual cohesion. I think that's going to be so important as we weather this crisis. And I was really reassured by some of the findings in the report that essentially gave us a snapshot just before this once-in-a-generation crisis, that EU cohesion was at its highest. And that's a good sign as we weathered the biggest storm that we've ever faced. So I thought it was incredibly helpful and very complementary with our own work, as I'll come back to say. But so just a few thoughts very briefly about our work and about the situation we are all in. I'm going to start with the obvious to say that, you know, we have found in our research that COVID presents a once-in-a-generation risk of increasing fractures that were already there. Fractures within families, fractures within the local units, fractures within nations, fractures within groups. And I think the elephant in the room is the vaccine campaign, which is going to be make or break for cohesion at every level. And I think we have to address that. Sadly, I think that's the issue that's going to stay in people's mind, very much so. In the work that we do, as you said, Sophie, we focus a little bit more on the individual aspect, on people's psychology. And also I'll share some insights from a very large survey we did in July 2020, so after the first wave in most countries in the EU. But again, we look very much at this question of cohesion, perhaps from a very complementary angle to the one taken by the report. We think about cohesion not so much as it relates to the EU or to institutions, but to one another. And perhaps we wouldn't use the word cohesion necessarily, which is probably a word that people don't really understand. It's a little bit technocratic. I think it works very well in the context of institutions. But possibly more personal, close to people definition would be something like togetherness or belonging, which I think is going to be of paramount importance, whether people feel like they belong or that sense of togetherness or not. So just one word on our methodology. So we essentially do large-scale surveys of people's psychological orientation. We ask them questions about how they raise their kids, about senses of belonging, about threat perception. And we take a national approach where we go under the hood of national opinion. And we create sort of families of Germans or French people by their psychological orientation. And we ask a range of questions on solidarity, on trust, specific to the COVID context in the summer. And we explored lots of issues around identity, history, also the relationship to Europe, climate, etc. So I'm going to share just a few 5 findings that we've got and maybe some thoughts about recommendations. And I'll do this very quickly so we can have a discussion. Finding number one is that there's no such thing as French opinion or German opinion about anything, really. We find that there are blocks of opinion within Germany or France or Poland or the UK or any other country. And those can be, in the shortest possible way, characterized around three groups. You've got an open group, which is generally pro-European, cosmopolitan, has a universalist outlook. When you ask them, is European identity important to you? The open group says, yes, European identity is important to me. Then you've got a closed group, has a narrow definition of what it means to belong to the national conversation, not so enthusiastic about Europe as we might imagine. But really the open and the closed group, we know them. You see them on Twitter. The most important group and the biggest group is what we call the invisibles or the forgotten. And they make up 4 out of 10 people in a place like Germany or France. They feel a sense of loss. They feel a greater sense of loneliness. And they were considerably harder hit by the pandemic in terms of their feelings of being abandoned by the state, by Europe, by other issues. And so so the first thing is, I don't think you can speak of French opinion on COVID-19 or on cohesion. You have to look at these blocks. These blocks, by the way, are incredibly important electorally. The second finding is that, and this goes very much along the lines of the ECFR research, is that regardless of objective performance on COVID in this large snapshot that we took in July 2020, countries that have social trust, which is similar concept to cohesion, people felt that they've received more care in the context, regardless of whether or not they actually did receive more care. So I'll take 2 examples, Italy and France. Italy has a remarkably high degree of social trust. People say that they've stuck together, and then that social trust index, a high social trust index, means that Italians feel solidarity to one another. Yes, the government hasn't done an ideal job, but we feel that we're in this together. France, where arguably the government response was possibly better than Italy, low social trust, and people have a low sense of belonging. And so countries with social trust are better equipped to weather this storm, and I think other storms, climate, artificial intelligence, and the other threats that Ambassador Vinhas mentioned. Third finding is that in July 2020, we found no love lost for the EU, aside from a small group. But from a somewhat cold perspective, a realization that we need each other. We need international cooperation. We need the EU. We need our neighbors to face this kind of threat and other threats. And so even among our identitarian groups, our closed groups who generally don't love Europe, they said, well, we still need our partners. But it's not from a warm perspective. It's from a sort of cold, realistic perspective. The fourth finding is that we found that particularly in societies like France and Italy, which were very hard hit by the pandemic, we asked the question, would you like to go back to normal as soon as possible? Or is this an opportunity to make change? And overall in the EU, there is an appetite for change. The COVID-19 crisis is a reminder that we should change things in our economy, in our society, in how we relate to nature. In our healthcare provision, etc. But in many countries, people who said, yes, I want change, they say, I don't believe the system can change. And this is particularly true of this forgotten group. And it's very true in Germany, very true in France in particular, but also in the UK. There's a sort of hope gap between, I want change. COVID-19 is a reminder to change. I don't believe the system can deliver change. And it's the fifth and final finding that I'll share is that it's pretty clear what people mean around change. It's jobs, it's healthcare provision, but it's also climate. But people don't react that well to the word climate. It's really the story of how we connect to nature. The COVID pandemic left Europeans wanting a new story of nature, but not climate targets that are far away and not 2030 emissions somewhere they don't know, particularly our forgotten group. They want to talk about food in the kids' cafeteria. They want to talk about river pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the findings. Just a few thoughts in terms of recommendations. I think that a focus on the forgotten, not looking at European opinion as a bloc, but focusing on the European forgotten. There is such a thing as the European forgotten. People who in Greece, in Portugal, in Germany and France feel forgotten. They have similarities. Less looking at national approaches and really understanding why the forgotten feel this sense of loss, and how can COVID recovery money, which is colossal amounts of money, be targeted at them. I also think there's something to be said about joy, about putting sort of joy and rediscovery and rebirth at the core of policies. I know this sounds very new agey, but I fundamentally believe that after a year where we've been locked in, a country that is full of joy like Portugal could place joy in a rediscovery of Europe, maybe a rediscover pass for Europe, some sort of voucher where you could go to museums and travel to other European countries. It would be a boost to the travel industry. It would be a good way to spend money, and it would be a way to practically bring joy and social cohesion to Europe. And then the final thing is, Europeans do not want climate change to move to a back burner. They want it moved to the front burner. That's what they want most. Support for the Green Deal is very high among all our segments. So those are just some few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mathieu. I think it was really interesting to hear these findings, and also maybe just as a little mention is that there is the Discovery EU program that has been put on the back burner by it was presented by the free interrail activists who are also part of the Connecting Europe network. And maybe it's a good reminder for the EU also to look at how to move closer to its citizens, and after once we hopefully overcome this pandemic. I know we're running a bit behind time, but I would like to hand over to Janis, Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the European Policy Center, who has been following the several crises in the past few years in the EU, so what we call the polycrisis. And it would be great to get your views on what has been said on the finding of the Cohesion Monitor, and what you think will be the most important steps coming up next.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks to all of you for your very interesting findings, which I tried to reflect now in 4 comments. One related to the experience of the past year of the crisis. One to the current situation, also trying to look a bit further ahead with all cautiousness. The first point, I think that what we witnessed in terms of the crisis management over the past year at the European level, I think that the EU has managed this crisis better than it has managed crises in the past, and also better than a good number of people expected a year ago. I think the key successes, I don't need to actually repeat them, but the fact that we agreed early on flexible state aid rules, on making the Stability and Growth Pact more flexible, and we cannot overestimate it, the ECB bazooka, which came very early in the crisis. Then the agreement in July, December on the Next Generation EU, the MFF, which I don't think it was a Hamiltonian moment, but it was huge in terms of its size and of its significance. So the EU has handled this crisis better than it handled many of the other crises which we witnessed in the so-called polycrisis of the past decade. And I think that there are 2 structural reasons for that, which we should always have in mind. One is that early on in the crisis, there was a big awareness and fear of the potential negative consequences of this crisis. If you go back to the Eurozone crisis in 2010, we actually were not aware of how big this crisis could become for a long period of time. Whereas this time, from the beginning, we were fearful of the potential negative consequences. And the second structural reason why I think we have handled this crisis better than previous crises is that this is a natural disaster. It is hitting everyone, yes, asymmetrically, as I think it was Sophie who reminded us in the beginning, but it is a natural disaster hitting everyone. It is not a man-made disaster. And that is a big difference compared to previous crises, which we witnessed, also the reactions to that. So the EU has shown a high level of resilience The doomsayers of 1 year ago were again proven wrong, as they have often been over the past 10 years. And I think the best crisis motto, and I think that's a lesson we should take from this crisis also with respect to future crises, is that if you expect the worst, this is the best recipe to avoid the worst. We haven't done that in other crises in the past, and I think this time we did, and we should remember that. The second point is that the vaccination crisis, I'll call it that way, does undermine or has the potential to substantially undermine cohesion. Here, Mathieu is right. It potentially could be a make or break moment with respect to how people perceive the EU in terms of the reaction to the crisis, which could then undermine cohesion at many, many different levels. So if that situation, the vaccine crisis, spirals out of control, I'm not saying that it will, but I'm just saying that it's a warning. If it would, it could have a very big negative impact on EU cohesion. The third point refers, I'm starting to refer to the future, the longer term perspective. Whether we will be able to glue together as an EU and whether the glue will continue to stick, to use an expression which Jana was using. And I think the answer to that, the honest answer is we don't know. Here, Ambassador Vinhas, you are right. It is too early to judge a lot of the consequences of the crisis. So I think we really need to be humble about our predictions. To quote what the EPC president is saying, Herman van Rompuy, expect the unexpected. That's another lesson of the past years and of the past year, that we should expect the unexpected. And we probably have to accept the fact that not only is polycrisis something which will probably continue, but that the perma-crisis is part of that new normal which we're experiencing over the past 10 years. And if we look at cohesion, we need to have that in mind, because it means that this is something we need to be treating as the new normal, the perma-crisis, and think of what that means with respect to cohesion. Now, if you look into the future further, I think there's a danger, and that was also something which has already been reflected by other speakers, that ghosts of the past could come back. Debt crisis, non-performing loans, bankruptcies, hitting all these things, hitting always the weakest member states. So that's one element of cohesion, and the weakest within our society, the individual level of cohesion. So these ghosts of the past might come back. And also, we might experience that there will be bigger differences among the EU 27 when it comes to the exit strategy. We were put together in this crisis. We were facing it together. As I said in the beginning, I think our reaction was more positive than in the past. But once we return to something which resembles a new normal, also new normal politics will come back at the European level. And there is a danger that we will have something which will be resembling a clash with respect to how we are trying to exit the crisis. And then what Jana was referring to in her introduction, the northern-southern challenge, I would call it, a mix of these two challenges could hit us. And this is something, I think, which is something we need to be aware, and it could be dangerous. And now comes my last point, and I want to be optimistic, because I think that there is a good reason to believe that we can be cautiously optimistic with respect to how the EU and how the member states will be able to come out of this crisis. But the key challenge which we actually have is that we need to early on prepare for the new normal, not only for the transition phase, where, Ambassador, you were right, we need to make sure that we implement what we decided in 2020, and that is key. But we actually have to start early on preparing ourselves for the new normal, which will come after the transition from where we are now to the moment where we enter this new normal, whenever that will come, whatever it will look like. And it will not look like a status quo ante. We're not returning back to where we were. And as Mathieu was saying, also I think a lot of people do not want and don't expect that we will be returning to something which will resemble a status quo ante. So the question is, how do we exploit the opportunities which are linked to the crisis? How do we exploit the fact that the crisis is an accelerator of trends? How do we adapt to the coming new realities? How do we counter the tendencies which still some have, is going back to the good old past, which actually will not happen, but there still is an inclination of some, let's go back to the good old days, which actually weren't that golden triumphant as some probably have thought, which also means that you need to very much concentrate on the social dimension And here I agree with Ambassador Vinhas. We need to agree, and the Portuguese presidency, we need to concentrate on the social dimension of the recovery process. It should not be an afterthought. It's not, only about increasing competition and resilience of our economies. It's also about making the recovery process reflecting the social dimension of that. And there is a danger that we won't do that. So we need to make sure that when we implement Next Generation EU and the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, we have the social dimension actually in place. So the key dimension is prepare for the new normal, last sentence. And I think we should use something which hopefully will be used for that purpose, which is the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, we've been talking about for a long time, but we should use that as an opportunity to prepare ourselves for the new normal and have in mind the transformational aspects of this crisis and of the future which is ahead of us. So deal with climate change, deal with the digital, deal with the global transformation. Don't deal with everything in the context of the conference. Concentrate on the main transformational challenges and put as a key narrative the ambition of preparing ourselves for the new normal. This is how you could use the conference involving citizens and representatives of governments and EU institutions. It is a mixed endeavor. It's not only about involving citizens, it's much more. Use that conference in order to prepare ourselves for the new normal, having in mind the transformational challenges which we're witnessing, and then address, last point what Mathieu was mentioning, address the forgotten ones, address the ones which often are very silent, but are very influential at national level, but that's also at European level. Thank you.
Thank you, Janis, for these points and putting it into context. We don't have much time, but we also don't have that many questions. So I would go to the one question I could see for now. If you have any other question, please raise your hands now. This is your opportunity. And then I'll just go for a final round, give it back to Jana and ask you one question at the end to close this off. But the one question that came in goes to you, Janis, straight away. And it asked the question how the US and EU economic response to the pandemics could be compared and what their impact could be. So I guess a clear comparison of like how the US reacted to the crisis and how the EU and yeah, the advantages and the inconveniences, I imagine.
Well, I think first of all, if you want to look at how the US has reacted to the economic crisis, first, who do we mean? Because we have had the Trump era and now we're having the Biden era, and they're two different worlds. And secondly, if you react to this crisis and you focus on it, you need to focus on the health dimension, not because of the health aspect only of the crisis, but because of the health aspect related to the economic situation. And here I think the reaction on the US side was not, to quote what the ambassador was saying, a humanistic one. It was something which was in state of denial, at least at the top of the old administration. And I think that had a negative economic effect on what was happening in the US. Whereas on the European side, I think we got it right, because we were actually from the beginning concentrating on the health dimension, but seeing that as a response to the economic consequences of the crisis. That was different from what we experienced in 2020 in the US. However, having said that, and that's an experience of previous crises, economic crises, when it comes to effectively managing the economic consequences of the crisis, the US often has a better track record. What has to do with how it is being configured, how it's being set up, what means it has supposedly it's a unitary state. We, as the ambassador was saying early on, we often struggle to get to a common position. It takes us some time, but once we get there, we actually, this time around, have come up economically with a counter package, the recovery package, which actually has a size which actually can make a difference. But here time matters. If we now lose too much time in the process of making sure that the national recovery resilience plans are being produced, are being adopted, and the money is starting flowing, and we need to hurry up to use the time as quickly as possible in order also the economic recovery to be as successful as it can, and always have in mind, as I said earlier, the forgotten ones, meaning, and the weakest ones at member state level and within societies as two elements of one story of cohesion.
Thank you. I would like to do a little final round where every one of you can, of course, comment on what they listen to, but also it would be great if you could respond to the question, and it's a little thought experiment. If you were an advisor to Mrs. von der Leyen in this crisis, what would you recommend to her, saying to strengthen European cohesion? What would be your one takeaway that you think the EU should focus on most? And we'll start off with Jana, who presented at the beginning. Go ahead.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'll draw on some of the recommendations that we made in our paper, where we kind of digested all the data. And I would basically say to Ursula von der Leyen that she needs to talk to the member states to make sure that some things are important to keep in mind. First, I think, yes, the EU has achieved a lot with the Recovery Fund, and it's great in many ways, but I think that the member states and the EU needs to be prepared to offer even more financial support. I think that the Recovery Fund was designed during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we don't have an idea how long this lasts and how this is going to affect our economies, especially also with regard to countries strongly dependent on tourism. So I think there might be a need for more money, and we need to prepare our populations carefully about it. I think that while doing this, it's important that member states or that the EU keeps this delicate balance between the interests of the northern countries, the southern countries, and also countries in the east. So I think we need to make sure that every kind of party in this stays on board. This has been the case, but we need to make sure that it does. And therefore, that's my last recommendation, I think that national leaders should be very careful when telling or when speaking to their audiences about this and the EU. So the countries in the south should basically communicate that the EU shows a lot of solidarity, that a lot of money is available, a lot of support, but that this money doesn't come basically for free and needs to be accompanied by the idea to use it for greening the EU and make it more digital, and also comes with the idea of structural reforms. And in the north, I think leaders need to tell the population that the EU is not an economic project only, but it's about more than that, and we need to treat it as more than a market. And that countries in the north only are well off, basically, if the system as a whole functions. And also to the kind of population in Central and Eastern Europe, I think it's important to communicate that membership entails obligations in terms of respecting common values. And I think there is a huge danger that member states might use this pandemic to claim that the national state is more important than European or international cooperation, and the vaccine crisis is a proof of this. So I think it's indeed a make it or break it moment, but I think we can emerge stronger if we really keep that cohesion kind of issue in mind and emphasize and not fall for kind of the cheap excuse blaming Brussels for everything. And I think the heads of state and government really have a say here and play a role. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Ambassador Vinhas.
Thank you, Sophie. Just 3 or 4 comments on what I've on the very interesting interventions of my colleagues in the panel. Well, the first is vaccination. Vaccination campaign is, of course, the key. I mean, it's a key issue. I mean, we cannot, I mean, when I say all of us, but the political leaders in our countries and the European institutions, we cannot fail to our citizens on this one. This, if I may use the famous sentence of Draghi some years ago, we have to do whatever it takes now with the vaccination strategy. This is absolutely key. Then I like very much the expression about the forgotten. I mean, it might be a sort of a synonymous of "don't leave anyone behind." That's what we are using, and I think it's very much aligned with maybe one of our the watermark priority in our presidency about the social dimension. So this is it's also key. I mean, we have to address and don't leave anyone behind and address the forgotten. Third, I don't like very much the idea of the new normal. I mean, because the new normal is very much linked to sort of we have to wear masks forever, or we will never hug again. And I don't like that very much. I would prefer, I do agree with Janis, I mean, we have to adapt to new realities, and particularly we have to manage the big challenges, and we have to prepare to that. That's, I mean, but new normal, it's at least it's very much linked to other things that we don't like. And in terms of communication, I don't think it's so good, although I agree fully with the idea. Finally, in a note of optimism, I mean, the EU is always in a sort of a dance between an ever fragile union and an ever closer union. I mean, we don't have to be. We don't have to be too pessimistic, even in a crisis like that. We all share that we have responded much better than in the previous one. And I think that, again, we are leading the climate agenda. We are leading, together with China and the US, the digital agenda. We are enhancing our social response in a very different way of the rest of the world. I mean, we are very powerful in trade. I mean, there's many reasons that we are also deepening the EMU. So we are at the same time, and sometimes the perception is about some fragility, but at the same time we are progressing in integration and we are moving ahead with the political resolve and confidence. So this is a note of optimism to conclude. And again, thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. As we're running over time, very quickly, still Mathieu Lefèvre and then Janis.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated all of that, and particularly your point, Ambassador Vinhas, about, we should be proud. My recommendation to Ursula von der Leyen would make us proud, make Europeans proud of everything we've achieved. And the vaccines is probably most important. I think we're at the moment where the wave of this social, economic, health tsunami is still here. We will see the degree of devastation when the wave starts to recede, which is why More in Common is preparing a very large snapshot of how Europeans are feeling as the wave starts to recede, maybe when vaccination levels are eventually reach the moment. So I think we need to prepare ourselves. I was somewhat worried by Ambassador Vinhas's timetable for when funds would.
Oh, just at I don't know if I think we have a technical problem. As we are running over time, I would hand over to Janis if you're there and go back to Mathieu afterwards. Yeah,
that was a pity. Just one remark. You're right, Ambassador. I should have, and I usually say that, post-COVID-19 reality. That's probably the better expression. But
I agree with you. It's just expression.
I know. But I think we have now already identified a good number of ideas, proposals, recommendations, which we would share with President von der Leyen. But I will be very frank and very blunt about what happened over the past month. I would concentrate on that. And there are lessons which need to be taken with respect to how the vaccination crisis of the last month had been dealt with. I personally think that if we look into the procurement of vaccination, the process, there are good reasons to make us understand why we are slower than others. And I think good reasons. So I won't go into detail, but the management of the last month was not the way it should have been. So my advice will be, once we get into similar difficult situation in the upcoming period, we will have similar difficulties. There's need to be cool-headed. Don't convey an impression that we are reacting very harshly and even creating the impression, as some have said, of panic. That's not the right thing to do. Second, listen to the advice. Listen to the advice from within your institution, within the Commission, and listen to the advice from outside. Don't only concentrate on a very small group of people, in order also to avoid certain of the mistakes which were committed, which were avoidable. I just mentioned Article 16. And the last part, communicate with all member states. Don't concentrate on particular member states. There was, within the last 4 weeks, often a concentration on the Commission President's home audience. That's not the Commission President's role. She should communicate with all Europeans and not single out individual member states. So that would be my piece of advice with respect to not commit mistakes committed over the past 4 weeks, because we will get into a situation which will be equally difficult and complicated. And if we get things wrong, that will undermine, to go back to the major theme of today's event, the cohesion between member states and within member states.
Thank you, Janis. Now that Mathieu is back, I don't know if you want to finish your sentence quickly because you were in the middle. All good. I think we got your main point that we need to be prouder. And Janis also had a few recommendations as a good think tanker. So as we're running over time, I'd just like to thank you for this panel. Thank you to the speakers, to the audience for staying in, and also for the events team to organize, as well as Melanie from Connecting Europe. It was a pleasure. We saw that cohesion is a difficult topic. It has different meanings. It can be structural cohesion, individual cohesion, between member states, between societies. But I think one of the main takeaways I take is that we need to really link EU policymaking stronger to the citizens and the societies to make sure that we get out of this crisis still having cohesion and not being ever fragile, as Ambassador Vinhas said, but ever closer between the peoples of Europe. So thank you very much and have a lovely Thursday. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.